Nearly a century ago, in the middle of the First World War, Canadians were fixated on the murder trial of a British domestic servant named Carrie Davies, who fatally shot a member of one of Canada's wealthiest families, Charles Burt Massey. Author and historian Charlotte Gray details the story in her new book, The Massey Murder, a maid, her master, and the trial that shocked a country. And here's Charlotte Gray with all the gory details. Welcome back to TVO.
Very nice to be here,
It's lovely
Steve.
to see you again. I want to start by just having you paint us a picture of what Toronto basically was a century ago, because obviously it's a totally different city. What was here?
At one level, it was a totally different city. It was a city that was 85% of the population were British in origin, and it was also a city that had a very rigid class system. There were the fine old families of Ontario that felt that they were the elite. There was still the remnants of the family compact that were all the decision makers. And then there were sort of gradations of British immigrants below that, down to blue-collar workers who were helping build the city. But at the same time, in this sort of quite static social structure, there was enormous turmoil because the city had actually doubled in size in the previous 10 years. I mean, that's an enormous and very destabilizing impact on the population. Suddenly there were immigrants coming from places other than the British Isles. They weren't necessarily Protestant. They weren't always English speaking. They were needed because it was a city expanding so fast because of all the new industry and all the new activities.
No, but they weren't South Asians or Africans either.
No, they weren't. They tended to be Jewish immigrants from Central Europe, Italians. So it was nothing like as mixed as it is today, nothing like as diverse. And there was a level of intolerance that today we find absolutely abhorrent.
How about if you were a woman in the Toronto of 100 years ago?
If you were a woman, you were just, if you were middle class and above, you were just sort of coming out of that Victorian straitjacket of thinking that you should be the angel in the house. Your realm was the private family, and it was the male responsibility to make the big decisions, like who should be elected and whether we should go to war. The middle class women were joining associations, suddenly becoming much more vocal, beginning to push for the vote. If you were a working class woman, you had been working, and your mother had been working all her life, and you were likely to be, like Carrie Davies, who I write about, you were likely to live a pretty miserable life in somebody's basement kitchen doing everything with no labor-saving devices. I mean, forget microwaves. They didn't even have vacuum cleaners.
But let's put just one last coat of paint on this part of it, which is, at the time your story is situated, we're well into World War I, and I guess most of the men of age are overseas. So what's left? Well,
the first contingent had left the previous September, and when they left the previous September, Toronto was abuzz with sort of patriotism, pro-imperialism. This was a crusade. This was sort of a noble endeavor to be associated with. You were going to defend the empire. By February 1915, the first ripples of fear that the First World War was not going to be a sort of matter of chivalry, that it was industrial warfare and slaughter on an unimaginable scale. The first intimations of that were happening. There were actually still quite a lot of men around in the sort of arms-bearing age, but they were another call-out had gone for volunteers. Another contingent left, in fact, in February 1915, and there was beginning to be the sense of, if you're of fighting age, isn't it time you went?
You got over there. Okay, let's talk about this. I got to tell you, I've lived in this city 35 years. I'm a history nut. I never heard of this. I never heard of this story, and I can't figure out, how did I not know about this? So how did you, who don't even live here, how did you find out about this?
This is my 9th book. My mission in life is to try and persuade Canadians. We have a fascinating and a really intriguing history. And so I'm constantly trying to think, how do you do that? Sort of what vehicle do you present history in that will make people realize that we have lots of good stuff? I realized that as the history shelves in bookstores were shrinking, what was growing? The shelves at the front that were carrying whodunits, Nordic thrillers, true crime, Scott Turow, trial novels. And I thought, okay, I'll find a true crime. And I sent out messages to all my historian friends and lawyers and legal historians, and they gave me wonderful suggestions. And this one, the story of Carrie Davis, who shot Bert Massey, was perfect for me because I really wanted to do a book about the home front during the First World War. We're just about to be hit by a tsunami of books about the First World War, but most of them, and they'll be very good, but most of them will be top down. It'll be about generals, prime ministers, cabinet ministers, and I wanted to know what it was like for the people back home, the mothers, the sisters, the fathers, the children. What was it like to be living in Toronto when you knew that your family, your breadwinner, your beloved son was in terrible danger?
Let's talk a little more about the two lead characters. Carrie Davies was how old?
She was 18.
And Bert Massey, whom she shot, was?
34.
34. There's no arguing she shot him.
None at all. In fact, there were several eyewitnesses.
Why did she shoot him?
Well, what happened was that, in fact, poor Bert, I just want to tell you that he was walking down Walmer Road.
This is in the Annex in Toronto.
Annex in Toronto around 6 o'clock in the evening on a February Monday, and the new electric lights had just come on. He was walking down, he turned into his gateway at 169 Walmer Road, walked up to the front door, opened the door, was horrified to see 18-year-old Carrie, who'd worked for the family for 2 years, standing there with his gun, and she fires 2 bullets.
And hits him.
Point blank, hits him, he staggers back, he's dead by the time he hits the sidewalk, and she's killed him in cold blood. Why? When Sergeant Brown from the local police station sort of finally tracks her down in the attic of the house, she says, "Come and get me, he tried to ruin me." And that's when, in fact, everybody realizes that because the man she shot was a Massey, this was much bigger than just a domestic spat. This was going to be a story that would be read outside Canadian borders. And so he tried to ruin me is the sort of pivot of the case. But what that meant then and what it means now are actually, we interpret them different ways.
So ruin today could have a number of different interpretations. I gather she, at the time, intimated that it meant, well, he tried to have his way with me.
He tried to ruin me. But how far did he get? And why did she not shoot him in the middle of, obviously, we assume without knowing anything, must have been a fairly sort of torrid encounter. Obviously, she had stayed in the house afterwards for 2 days, and it just seems incomprehensible now why she stayed, and what did she really mean?
Did you uncover any evidence, any eyewitness testimony, anything which would have lended credence to her claim, essentially, that he tried to rape her? That's what she's saying, right?
She said he tried to. Actually, what she said was he tried to kiss me, and he then sort of tried to. A few minutes later, again, he tried to sort of. It wasn't a violent encounter, but he was her boss, so it must have been very frightening for an 18-year-old girl.
Who's not from Canada.
Who's not from Canada. And when this happened 2 days earlier, she had run out of the house and run to her sister. But she had said, according to her brother-in-law, that he had tried to kiss her, and but that he would be feeling ashamed of himself by now. At that stage, it sounds like she thought he was drunk and being a bit foolish, and he didn't try and assault her again after she returned to the house. So it was clear that something had happened, but it was also clear that her state of mind was, she wavered between being very, very scared, but also dismissing it. She had a very clever lawyer, though, and that was where we hear all the details that the lawyer wanted the jury to hear.
Well, she had a clever lawyer, but he was a Massey, and presumably had all of the powers and resources available to one of the, as you put them, fine old families of the time. Did they bring that power to bear to try to ruin her?
No. The Masseys are a complicated family. And the Masseys at this stage were one of the foremost families in Toronto, well known for all their philanthropy. Massey Hall.
This is Massey Hall, Massey Ferguson, Massey Harris. Vincent Massey would be a descendant, a future Governor General.
No, Vincent Massey was first cousin. He went to Bert's funeral. So they were very well known. But there was a fracture in the family. And so Bert's family, in fact, had essentially been disowned by Hart Massey, the patriarch, before his death in the 1890s. There's quite a messy story there of how Bert, who was the son of the eldest son, had no birthright, had no legacy from a very, very wealthy man. You know, one of the most fascinating things as I go around talking about the book is that I've met several Massey descendants, and a couple actually were very helpful when I was writing the book. And they all keep saying to me, you know, it's really interesting reading your book because we know no family history.
Interesting. Isn't that something? This must have been, I know as I was reading the book, I thought to myself, this is in a bit like Chicago. This is Roxy Hart, Chicago, you know, the newspapers which had a field day with that. We had, I guess, the Toronto Daily Star and the Evening Telly at the time. How much fun did they have with this case?
So much fun.
Yeah.
So much fun because it was actually just a football in a brutal circulation war. Toronto at this point, 500,000 people, 6 newspapers, combined circulation of 500,000 because newspapers are the only source of information. You know, no radio, no television, no internet, no anything. If you want news, you have to buy a newspaper.
Are we the Globe and Mail yet, or are we still the Globe and the Mail and Empire?
It's the Globe. And the Globe, unlike the Star and the Telly, the Globe comes out in the morning and is unbelievably stuffy. Okay. Doesn't do murder. But the evening papers, they made a meal of it because they decide, they have a fight over who's the victim. Is it the man who was shot and fell to the sidewalk, lost his life, or is it the 18-year-old girl who feared being ruined? And they took 2 sides. And from the start, one of them, the Star, the Telly, who takes Carrie's side, they describe her as looking like a Sunday school pupil. The Star, who decides that she's a murderess, they describe her as having a Slavic jut to her brow and a mouth that breathes resentment. They're talking about the same 18-year-old.
That's hilarious. There were feminists, of course, at the time. Not as there would be 45 years after that, but there were at the time. And I wonder what kind of role they played in all of this.
They played a big role, actually, because as I mentioned earlier, this is a point when there's lots of women's organizations, lots of women's activities. Some women put all their energy into fighting for the vote. Others were busy looking after the welfare of the poor in Toronto. But the Massey case, in fact, was a challenge and it put some of these women in a dilemma because they actually did want to help Carrie. They knew the vulnerability of young women in households. But on the other hand, they socially knew the masses. So where did their loyalty lie? Did their loyalty lie to their class, the masses, or did it lie to with their gender, Carrie, the little girl, as her lawyer kept calling her? But they did go to bat for her in various ways. Not directly for her, although at one point they offered to find her a barrister to represent her in court, but because they were busy, in fact, shoring up the existence of institutions that sound bizarre to us today. But in Toronto at that point, there was a women's court. Women who went to court had a particular police court where there were only women spectators, only women officials, because that way the women would be protected from the male hangers-on who were leering at them.
This now is the awkward part of our conversation because we're not going to give away the verdict. She goes on trial, obviously, for murder, and we're not going to give away the verdict here. But I want to ask you so much about the verdict and what you thought of it, but I can't do that. So let me just simply ask this. Having looked at all of the trial and the ensuing shenanigans around that, do you think she got a fair trial?
I don't think she got a fair trial, but I think they got the right verdict.
Even though we're not going to say what it is?
Even though we're not going to say what it is.
You think they got it right? Was it judge or jury?
It was jury. As every lawyer will tell you, juries are unpredictable.
And this one was?
Yes.
Did you know the verdict before you started writing the story?
Oh, yes,
You
I
did
did.
know. Okay.
I did. And it was a case, one of the reasons that we haven't heard of it was that it was so badly handled by the judge. An extraordinary character in our past called Sir William Mulock, the grand old man. It was so badly handled by him because he misdirected the jury, and there were several steps he took that were completely inappropriate. That in fact there was really nothing for sort of the legal profession to do with this case, and because of the result, there was no appeal.
No appeal. But you, having looked at it, are content with the verdict.
Yes.
Okay, I've just learned something new about you. But I'm not, we're not going to say what it is. So we'll just leave it at that. So the tentacles that this verdict may have had in terms of its impact on Canadian law to come, significant or not?
Not significant until it was rediscovered by legal historians and feminists like Constance Backhouse in the 1970s. And the reason it became significant then is that it's really proof of how malleable the law is and how the law really does just, at its best, it reflects the social attitudes and standards of the society, Canadian society, at a point in time. And, you know, I'm just watching, for example, the euthanasia debate today and how we're probably going to see legal changes there, or at least I hope we're going to have a very informed debate on it. And it's a very similar point in history today, dealing with that issue, as the point in history in 1915, as a young girl is accused of murder for shooting her employer, and a point when women were fighting to have their rights, and how all these different forces interplay. How do we change the law? How do we persuade lawmakers and justices that what's on the statute books is inappropriate?
Book number 9, eh?
Book number 9.
Book number 9. Good for you. Keep it going. The Massey Murder, a maid, her master, and the trial that shocked a country. And this reader with the verdict. Charlotte Gray, thanks a lot for coming in tonight.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.